Story 1. I was about 12 or 13 when this happened, and to this day I still don't have an explanation for it. I don't tell many people because it sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud, but it happened. I know what I saw. It was the summer of '98, and I was staying the night at my friend Kevin's house. His parents were out of town for the weekend, which meant we had the whole house to ourselves. No babysitter, no older sibling keeping an eye on us. Just two kids with too much time and no supervision. Kevin lived in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where people left their doors unlocked, and where nothing ever really happened. His house was this old two-story with an attic and a basement that I always thought were a little creepy, but we didn't spend much time in either. We mostly hung out in his room or the living room, watching movies and playing video games. That night, though, we were feeling restless. Around 10 or so, we got the brilliant idea to go outside and mess around. You know, ding-dong ditching, sneaking through backyards, just stupid kid stuff. We weren't exactly delinquents, but we liked pushing boundaries. We ran around for a couple of hours, giggling like idiots whenever we barely made it away from a porch light, flicking on, or a dog barking. By the time we got back to Kevin's house, it was late, probably around 1:30 a.m. We locked the door behind us, grabbed some snacks from the kitchen, and headed up to his room. I remember flopping onto his bed, already feeling that drowsy, satisfied exhaustion creeping in. Kevin was sitting in his desk chair, flipping through channels on the TV. Then the doorbell rang. Both of us froze. Our first thought was cops. Maybe someone had seen us messing around and called the police. Or maybe it was an angry neighbor who caught on to what we were doing. Either way, not good. Kevin muted the TV. We just sat there for a second, listening. The doorbell rang again. Kevin gave me this wide-eyed look, and I motioned for him to check the window. His house had this narrow window in the hallway that overlooked the front porch, just to the right of the door. It was small, and from outside, you wouldn't even know someone was looking out of it unless you were standing directly in front of it. Kevin got up slowly, crept out into the hallway, and peeked out. I followed right behind him. I will never forget what I saw. Standing on the porch, illuminated by the yellow porch light, was an old woman. She had long gray hair, parted in the middle, and she was wearing this faded, old-fashioned dress that looked like something out of the early 1900s. Her face was pale, wrinkled, and expressionless. She wasn't smiling, wasn't frowning, just standing there, staring at the door. Next to her was a boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old. He was wearing an old-timey outfit, a dark vest, a white button-up shirt, knickers, and scuffed-up boots. A newsboy cap sat low on his head, casting a shadow over his eyes. He was just standing there too, completely still. Kevin whispered, "Who the hell is that?" I shook my head. I had never seen these people before, and something about them felt off. "Maybe they need help," Kevin whispered. I didn't say anything, but I felt this creeping sensation in my stomach. Something was wrong. The woman reached up and knocked on the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Kevin ducked down, pulling me with him. My heart was pounding. "What do we do?" Kevin whispered. I peeked over the window ledge. They were still there, standing motionless. "Maybe they'll just go away," I whispered back. We waited. 10 seconds. 20. I wasn't going to risk looking again, but Kevin did. He peeked up for half a second, then immediately pulled back, his face pale. "They're gone," he whispered. I frowned. "Gone? Gone, dude. They just..." I didn't believe him. I had only looked away for a few seconds. I slowly raised myself up, just enough to peek over the edge again. He was right. The porch was empty. I looked up and down the street. Nothing. No people, no cars, no sign of anyone leaving. It was as if they had just vanished. Kevin and I sat there in silence, barely breathing. Every hair on my body was standing up. "What the fuck?" Kevin whispered. I didn't answer. I couldn't. We crept back to his room, shutting the door behind us like that would somehow keep whatever that was from coming inside. We didn't talk much after that. I think we were both trying to process what we had just seen. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the house made my skin crawl. I kept picturing that woman and that boy standing there staring at the door. waiting. By morning, it felt almost unreal, like a bad dream. But it wasn't. I know it wasn't. We never talked about it again. Story 2. I live in a small, quiet town in Kentucky, about an hour outside Pikeville. Nothing much happens around here. It's the kind of place where people don't lock their doors until something happens that makes them start. I've lived in this house for years. Bought it when my daughter Emily was a baby. It's not fancy, but it's ours. 3 bedrooms, a living room that always smells a little like the wood stove, and a hallway that creaks no matter how many times I nail the boards back down. Emily is 14 now, which means her room is always a disaster. Clothes on the floor, half-empty soda cans on her desk, makeup smeared across the dresser. I'd been telling her for weeks to clean it, and like most teenagers, she ignored me. I wasn't mad, just tired of stepping over her mess every time I walked past her door. That night, I was already in a bad mood. Work had been stressful, and I had a splitting headache. I just wanted to make some tea, sit in my chair, and not think for a while. I walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, passing Emily's room like I always did. Her door was half open, and I glanced inside without really thinking. She was standing there, right in the middle of her room, facing away from me. Long, dark hair hanging loose over her shoulders, hands at her sides. The room was dim, the only light coming from the lamp on her nightstand, casting a soft yellow glow over the mess. I exhaled through my nose. Finally, I muttered. I kept walking. Didn't say anything to her. Didn't need to. She was doing what I'd been asking her to do for weeks. I went into the kitchen, turned on the kettle, and leaned against the counter, rubbing my temples. The quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the room. The faint ticking of the old wall clock. A few minutes later, I heard the bathroom door open down the hall. Footsteps. Emily walked into the kitchen, her dark hair wet and clinging to her neck. A towel was wrapped around her body, and she was rubbing another one over her head. She froze when she saw me. "What?" she said. I stared at her. "How did you do that so fast?" She frowned. "Do what?" I turned my head toward the hallway. My skin prickled. I'd just seen her in her room, standing there. I opened my mouth, then shut it again. My stomach twisted in a way I didn't like. Emily's face changed. "Why are you looking at me like that?" I swallowed. My voice felt wrong in my throat. "I thought you were in your room." She stared at me, not blinking. "I was in the shower." We both stood there, neither of us speaking. My ears were ringing. Something cold slid down my spine like an ice cube. I turned my head slowly toward the hallway again. The light in Emily's room was still on, the door still half open. I knew what I had seen. I had seen my daughter standing in her room. I had walked past her, seen her dark hair, the way her arms hung at her sides. I had thought nothing of it. And now she was standing right here, dripping onto the kitchen floor. She whispered, "Who was in my room?" My breath hitched. I didn't answer. I just moved. I stepped out of the kitchen, back down the hallway, Emily right behind me. My heart was slamming against my ribs so hard it made me feel sick. The house felt too quiet, the air thick, wrong. I reached her bedroom door. The lamp was still on. The room was empty. I looked at the spot where I had seen her. Nothing. I stepped inside, every muscle in my body screaming at me to stop. The floor creaked under my weight. The air smelled like her shampoo, her perfume. But something was off. It felt colder, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees in just the past couple of minutes. Emily hovered behind me, gripping her towel. Her breathing was sharp, quick. I could feel her fear pressing against me like a physical thing. I scanned the room. The closet door was cracked open. My stomach twisted. I stepped toward it, my pulse hammering in my ears. My fingers shook as I reached out. I pulled the door open. Empty. Clothes, shoes, some junk piled in the corner. Nothing. My mouth was dry. Maybe I imagined it. Emily made a tiny strangled sound. I turned to look at her. Her face had gone pale. Her eyes were wide, staring past me. I felt it before I heard it. A whisper, right behind me. Not words, just breathe. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my footing. My hand shot out, flicking the light switch. The room flooded with brightness. Nothing. Emily whimpered. I grabbed her wrist and yanked her toward the hallway, slamming the door behind us. We didn't sleep in our rooms that night. We stayed in the living room, the TV on but muted, sitting stiffly on the couch, wrapped in blankets. I held her hand. Neither of us spoke. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know what was in my daughter's room, but I know what I felt, and I know we were not alone. Story 3. I grew up in a small town in Kentucky, nothing fancy, just the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business and life moved slow. My family lived in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town, close to a lake that was mostly used for fishing and the occasional picnic. It wasn't a big lake, but it was deep, and it had this murky greenish-brown color that never quite sat right with me. Even on the sunniest days, it looked dark. I was 17 at the time, training for cross-country. I wasn't great, but I was fast enough to make the team, and I liked running. It gave me time to think. Most afternoons, I'd take the same route, cut through my neighborhood, past the old church, and then down to the lake before looping back home. It was a quiet run, peaceful, until that day. It was late September, and the air had that crisp, cool bite to it. The sky was overcast, just gray enough to make everything feel a little dull, a little off. I remember stepping out of my house, stretching my legs, popping in my earbuds, and heading off like usual. Everything was fine until I got close to the lake. I don't know how to explain it, but the second I turned onto the road that led down to the water, something in my brain screamed, no. Not just a little bad feeling, not just a vague unease. This was a full-body, gut-deep, instinctual rejection of the place ahead of me. Like I had just stepped up to the edge of a cliff, and some primal part of me knew if I took another step forward, I'd die. I stopped running so fast it almost hurt my knees. My breathing was fine, but my chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped a rope around it and pulled. My whole body felt wired, hyper-aware of everything around me. The trees swaying in the wind, the empty sidewalk, the distant hum of a car somewhere far off. But mostly the lake. It wasn't even in sight yet, but I knew it was there, just down the hill, past the bend in the road. I pulled out my earbuds, suddenly hating the way they muffled the world around me. I expected to hear something, anything to explain why I felt like this. Maybe a weird noise. Maybe someone walking nearby. Maybe, hell, I don't know, but something. But there was nothing. Just silence. A dead, heavy silence. And that's when I realized something that made my stomach drop. I had been running this route for months. Every time I passed this area, I'd hear crickets, birds, the rustling of squirrels in the trees, something alive. But now, nothing. No bugs, no wind through the leaves, no distant sound of water lapping against the shore. The whole world felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, and that was enough. I turned around and ran. Not a jog, not a casual run. I sprinted. I didn't care if I looked stupid. I didn't care if someone saw me and thought I was being dramatic. Every hair on my body was standing up, and I knew if I kept going toward that lake, I wasn't coming back. When I burst through my front door, my mom was in the kitchen, sipping coffee. She raised an eyebrow at me. Back already? I was breathing too hard to answer at first. I wasn't out of shape, but my body had dumped so much adrenaline into my system that I felt sick. I leaned against the counter, shaking my head. I swallowed, trying to steady my voice. I couldn't do it. My mom set her coffee down. What do you mean? I shook my head again. I don't know. I got close to the lake and I exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of my neck. I couldn't go. Something felt wrong. Really, really wrong. Mom's face changed. Not in a "you're being ridiculous" way. More like concern. Like a panic attack? She asked carefully. I hesitated. I'd never had one before, but I'd seen friends go through them. This hadn't felt like that. No, I said finally. It wasn't like that. It was like... I struggled to find the words. Like every part of me knew I had to get away from there. Mom didn't say anything for a moment. Then slowly she nodded. "Okay," she said. "You did the right thing coming back." That was the end of it. I showered, ate dinner, and tried to shake it off. But I couldn't. That feeling, that absolute certainty that I had narrowly avoided something terrible, stayed with me. 3 days later, they found the body. It was all over the local news. A fisherman had called the cops after spotting something floating near the far end of the lake, caught against some driftwood. It was a man, badly decomposed, barely recognizable. They didn't release many details at first, just that he'd been missing for a while. But the second I saw that news report, my stomach dropped. I didn't need the details. I didn't need to know how he died or who he was. I just knew he was already in that water when I was running that day. And if I had gone down to that lake, I don't know. I don't know what would have happened. Maybe nothing. Maybe I would have just found him, floating there, and it would have traumatized me, but that's it. But deep down, I don't believe that. I believe I would have seen something I wasn't meant to see. Or worse, something would have seen me. I never ran that route again. Story 4. I was watching my parents' dog while they were out of town for the weekend. They only lived about 20 minutes from me, in the house we'd grown up in, so it wasn't a big deal. The dog, Murphy, was old and mostly just slept, so I figured it'd be a quiet couple of days. It had been almost a year since my sister Amy passed away. She died in that house, not violently, not mysteriously, just unexpectedly. An undiagnosed heart condition. She was 27. One day she was fine, and the next she was gone. I was still struggling with it. We all were. My parents didn't talk about her much, not because they didn't care, but because it hurt too much. The house was different now, quieter, even when people were in it. You don't really notice a person's presence until it's missing. That night, after feeding Murphy and taking him out, I made a sandwich, watched some TV, and turned in early. The house always had these strange creaks and pops at night, old pipes, settling wood. It never used to bother me, but after Amy died, I found myself listening to them differently. The way the walls groaned, the way the wind moved through the gutters. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. No reason, just one of those times where your body decides it's had enough sleep, even though it clearly hasn't. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the house. Murphy was snoring downstairs. Then I heard it, a sound from the hallway, a soft thump. Not a creak, not a pop, a deliberate noise, like something falling. I got up, rubbing my face, and stepped into the hall. The light from a street lamp outside leaked in through the window, giving the place a dim, bluish glow. I checked my parents' bedroom first. Nothing. Then the bathroom. Empty. I walked toward the staircase, and that's when I saw it. Amy's picture. It had fallen from the wall. It lay face up on the hardwood floor, the glass frame miraculously unbroken. It was the photo my mom kept in the upstairs hallway, right by my old bedroom door, one of the few pictures my parents still had up of her. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself that it had just slipped. Houses shift, nails loosen. That's all it was. I picked it up, checked the hook on the wall, nothing seemed wrong with it, and placed it back where it was. For a minute, I stood there waiting to see if it would fall again, as if the house might prove me wrong, but it didn't. I shook my head, exhaled, and turned to go back to bed. Then I noticed the living room. I froze. Something was wrong. Even in the dark, I could tell. I walked slowly down the stairs, every hair on my arm standing on end. The house felt off, like stepping into a room where someone had just been, except there was no one there. Then I saw them, the other pictures. Every single picture of Amy had fallen. There weren't many to begin with. My parents never kept a lot of photos up, but the few they had, all of them were on the floor. The one on the fireplace mantel, the one by the TV, the one on the shelf near the bookcase. Not a single other picture in the house had moved, just hers. I just stood there, heart pounding, my breathing too loud in my own ears. I felt something then, not a presence, not a ghostly whisper, just a weight, a thick, pressing weight, like the air had turned to liquid around me. Murphy let out a low whine from his bed in the corner. He hadn't moved, just lay there, ears pinned back, watching me. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "Okay," I muttered to myself. My own voice sounded strange, uncertain. There was an explanation. There had to be. Maybe the house had shifted. Maybe there had been a microquake or something. Maybe... My phone was upstairs. I needed to check it. If there'd been even the smallest tremor, I could prove to myself that this was nothing. I turned, walked quickly, too quickly, up the stairs, grabbed my phone from the nightstand, and Googled Ohio earthquake with shaking fingers. Nothing. No reports. No seismic activity. Nothing. I sat there on the edge of the bed, my pulse hammering in my neck. I kept telling myself to get a grip, that I was being stupid. But then, a sound, not from inside the house, from outside, from my car. I hesitated, then slowly walked to the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to see. My car was parked in the driveway. The interior light was on. I stared at it, heart slamming against my ribs. I hadn't left it on. I was sure of that. I had driven here, parked, locked the doors like always. My breathing felt loud, too loud. Murphy let out another low whimper from downstairs. I turned away from the window. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to check. Every part of me screamed to stay inside. Then, a click. Software. A sound I knew too well, the sound of my glove compartment opening. I stopped breathing. I didn't move. I just listened. No footsteps, no voices, just the silence stretching, thick, heavy. Then the light inside my car went off. Darkness swallowed the driveway. I backed away from the window, my legs numb. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers ice cold, and dialed 911 without even thinking. The operator picked up. "911, what's your emergency?" I tried to find words. My voice barely came out. I think someone's outside my house." The question that followed was routine, but I barely heard it. Something about whether I'd seen anyone, whether anything was broken into. I looked back toward the window. The light inside my car turned back on. I dropped the phone. It clattered to the floor, the operator's voice still coming through. The glove compartment was hanging open, and sitting inside it, face up, was a picture of Amy and me, a picture I knew I had packed away, one I hadn't seen in years. I didn't go outside, I couldn't. I stayed in that room, gripping my phone with white knuckles, listening for sirens, for footsteps, for anything. By the time the cops arrived, there was no one there. No sign of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. Just the picture, sitting there, waiting, like someone had put it there on purpose, like someone wanted me to see it. I never told my parents, never told anyone really. What would I even say? That I thought my dead sister had broken into my car? That she had knocked her own pictures off the wall? Number because I don't believe in that sort of thing. I don't. But to this day, I still can't explain it. And the picture? I never brought it back inside. I left it in the car. And a week later, it was gone. Story 5. I don't really believe in ghosts, or at least I didn't. I live alone in a small one-bedroom apartment on the second floor of an old brick building. Nothing fancy, just a cheap place with thin walls, creaky floors, and pipes that bang sometimes. It's not haunted. I mean, it never felt haunted. That night was just like any other. I had stayed up late watching something on my laptop, and around 2 a.m., I got hungry. I don't cook much, but I love toast. Just buttered toast, simple. So I got up, walked into my kitchen, and started making some. It's a small kitchen, a little counter space, a few cabinets above and below, an old fridge that hums too loud, and a stove I barely use. The toaster sits on the counter near the sink. I popped 2 slices of bread in and leaned against the counter, scrolling on my phone while I waited. The toaster clicked. The smell of warm bread filled the kitchen, and I buttered my toast. I stood there, facing the counter, eating. I wasn't thinking about anything, just half zoned out, slowly chewing, staring at my phone, then at my plate, just standing there. I was in that spot for maybe 5 minutes. When I was done, I rinsed the plate, wiped the counter, and turned around. Every single cabinet door and drawer was open, wide open. I just stood there. My brain refused to process it. Like I was seeing it, I knew I was seeing it. But my mind was rejecting it. No sound, no movement. Just the silent, gaping mouths of every cupboard and drawer in my kitchen. I felt something deep in my stomach, a pressure that built up in an instant, like the moment you realize you're in danger but don't know from what. I had been right there. I would have heard them open, wouldn't I? I turned back around to the counter, staring at the toaster, the sink, the spot where I had been standing. I turned back again, still open. Every single one. A slow, suffocating dread settled over me. I wasn't alone. The thought crawled into my skull like a whisper. I wasn't alone. My eyes darted to the space behind the fridge. No one. The small pantry, empty. The tiny laundry nook in the hallway, no shadow. The front door, locked. No one had come in. I took a step forward, then stopped. The air felt heavy, thick, like the moment before a thunderstorm. I don't know why, but my instincts kicked in. I needed to act normal. I needed to not react. So I did the only thing I could think of. I walked to the first open cupboard, took the handle, and slowly, calmly closed it. Then the next one, and the next. One by one, I shut them, my hands barely trembling, my breathing steady even though my heart was slamming against my ribs. The drawers came last. Each one slid shut smoothly, like they had never moved at all. When the last one closed, I stood there, hands at my sides, staring at the kitchen like nothing had happened. And then I turned, walked straight to my room, and shut the door. I didn't sleep. I didn't even get in bed. I sat on the floor back against the wall, staring at the door until daylight. Nothing else happened. The next morning I checked the kitchen again. Everything was normal. No signs of forced entry, no explanation, just nothing. I told myself maybe I had somehow done it without realizing. Sleep deprivation, stress. But that wasn't true. I know what I saw, and I know what I didn't hear. I still live there. I still use that kitchen, but I don't make toast at night anymore. Story 6. I grew up in a quiet little town, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody. My school was a simple, single-story building, nothing fancy, just brick walls, flickering fluorescent lights, and long covered walkways connecting the classrooms. These walkways had metal poles spaced out evenly along the concrete path, holding up the overhangs. I walked under them every day, rain or shine. They were just part of the scenery, something I never paid much attention to, until one day, one specific pole changed everything. I was in 5th grade when it happened. It was one of those dreary, wet afternoons where the rain wasn't exactly heavy, but it was enough to make everything feel cold and miserable. The kind of drizzle that coated everything in a slick layer of moisture, turning the sidewalks dark and the air thick with that damp smell of wet pavement and old concrete. I was walking alone under the covered walkway, heading towards the cafeteria for lunch. My shoes made soft, squelching sounds against the wet pavement, leaving behind a clear trail of footprints in the thin layer of water on the concrete. I remember zoning out, just staring straight ahead, thinking about nothing in particular. Then someone shouted, "Ball!" It came from my right, somewhere beyond the walkway, out in the open part of the playground. Instinctively, I turned my head to look. It was just a reflex. I wasn't even playing with them. But when you hear someone yell about a ball, you look. Maybe it's coming at you. Maybe you need to dodge. I didn't see anything though. No ball, no kids running after it, just the gray sky and the distant fence at the edge of the field. And then, this is the part that still makes my stomach turn, I stopped walking. Not because I meant to. Something just clicked in my head, like a delayed realization, and I froze. There was supposed to be a pole. I felt it in my gut first, this sick, twisting feeling of wrongness. I slowly turned my head forward again, my heart already picking up speed, and looked around. The pole was behind me. I stared at it, unblinking. My mind couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. My footprints, my own wet footprints, led straight through the spot where the pole stood. not around it, not beside it, through it. I took a slow, shaky step back, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. I followed the footprints with my eyes. There they were, clear as day, a straight line leading up to the base of the pole, and then continuing perfectly on the other side, as if the pole had never been there at all. My stomach lurched. I felt dizzy, lightheaded, like the ground beneath me had just shifted. I looked around frantically, expecting someone else to notice, to say something, to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. But there was no one near me. The other kids were still playing out in the rain, their voices distant, oblivious. I took another step back. My breath felt thick in my throat. I wanted to touch the pole, to prove to myself that it was real, that it had always been there. My fingers trembled as I reached out. Cold metal. It was solid, real, just like every other pole in that walkway. I gripped it, squeezing tight, half expecting my hand to pass through it. But it didn't. It was there. So then how the hell had I walked through it? I stumbled back, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I looked down again. My footprints were still there, perfect and impossible. I followed them with my eyes over and over, trying to make sense of it. Nothing made sense. A sharp, cold panic started creeping up my spine. Something deeper than fear, something ancient and wrong. Like the world had glitched for a second, and I had slipped through a crack in reality without even noticing. Had I disappeared for just a moment? Had the pole not existed when I walked there? Or had I gone somewhere else for the briefest fraction of a second? Somewhere where that pole didn't exist? I heard something then. Not a voice, not a word. A sound. It was soft, almost like a whisper, but not a voice. More like the absence of sound. A hollow, stretching silence curling around the edges of reality. I felt it in my bones before I heard it. I spun around, searching for the source. The rain had stopped. The air felt too still, too thick. The world didn't feel right anymore. The pole was real now, but what if it hadn't been for just a second? What if I hadn't been real? I don't know how long I stood there. Could have been seconds, could have been minutes. My hands felt ice cold. My skin prickled. Then suddenly the sounds of the schoolyard snapped back into place. The distant shouts, the patter of rain, the squeak of sneakers on wet pavement. The world felt normal again, but I wasn't normal anymore. I walked away, slowly at first, then faster. I didn't look back at the pole. I didn't want to see my footprints again. I didn't tell anyone. Because what would I even say? That I walked through a solid object? That the world forgot to exist for a second? That something had been watching, just out of sight, just beyond the edge of understanding? No one would believe me, but I know what happened. Story 7. I'm not the kind of person who jumps at shadows or believes in ghosts. I like things that make sense. Logic, reason, science. If I hear a strange noise at night, I don't assume it's a demon or some spirit. It's the wind, the house settling, maybe an animal outside. But what happened that evening at the beach? I still can't explain it. And believe me, I've tried. It was supposed to be a simple trip. My best friend Travis and I had been playing guitar together for years, almost every day. And that weekend, we decided to take our girlfriends to the beach. We packed a cooler, a couple of blankets, and a bag of mushrooms. Just enough for a mellow trip, nothing crazy. The plan was to enjoy the sunset, play some music, and just let the night take us wherever. The first couple of hours were perfect. We sat near the water, watching the waves roll in while the mushrooms slowly worked their way through our systems. It was one of those quiet, weightless highs where everything feels a little brighter, a little softer. At some point, Travis got up and dusted off his shorts. "I think I'm gonna go for a walk," he said. His girlfriend Rachel frowned. "By yourself?" "Yeah, just need to clear my head for a bit." I didn't think much of it. That was just Travis. When he got high, he liked to wander. He'd disappear for a while, come back, and tell us about whatever weird thoughts he'd had. Nothing unusual. The three of us stayed behind, lying on the blankets, talking about nothing in particular. Time got slippery after a while. At some point, Rachel sat up and looked around. "Where's Travis?" I was about to answer when I heard something. A guitar. It was faint but clear. Someone was strumming, slow and steady. Not a song, just random chords, like someone absent-mindedly picking at the strings. I knew that sound. It was Travis. I sat up. "He's over there." I pointed toward the trees that lined the edge of the beach. The music was coming from somewhere past them, deeper into the woods. The girls looked at me like I was crazy. Rachel shook her head. "I don't hear anything." I frowned. "You seriously don't hear that?" They both just stared at me. "It's faint, but it's there," I said. "Come on, let's just follow it." They hesitated, but I was already on my feet, moving toward the trees. The music was steady, unbroken. I could hear Travis playing like he was sitting right in front of me. I led the way, stepping over roots and ducking under branches. The farther we went, the darker it got. The sounds of the ocean faded behind us, swallowed by the stillness of the forest. But the guitar never stopped. Every few steps, I glanced back at the girls. Rachel looked uneasy, but she followed. My girlfriend clung to my arm. "Are you sure this is the right way?" she whispered. "Yeah," I said. "It's getting clearer." I kept moving, pushing deeper into the trees. The music stayed just ahead, always the same distance away, like Travis was walking too, keeping pace. I called out his name, but he didn't answer. He just kept playing. And then suddenly, there he was. He was standing in a small clearing, back to us, staring off into the trees. His hands were hanging at his sides. His posture was stiff, almost unnatural. Something about it made my stomach drop. "Travis?" I stepped forward. He turned slowly, his face blank, like he hadn't expected to see us. Rachel rushed past me. "Where the hell have you been? We've been looking for you." Travis blinked, like he was coming out of a daze. He stopped, looking at me. "Why are you guys here?" I let out a nervous laugh. "Dude, I followed the sound of your guitar." His expression didn't change. "What guitar?" he said. For a second, I thought he was messing with me. Then I really looked at him. His hands were empty. His shoulders were bare. He wasn't wearing his guitar strap. I felt a sudden, horrible stillness in my chest. My voice caught. "We left them at home." The words hung in the air. I could still hear it. The music. It was still playing. Right there. Right next to us. But Travis wasn't playing. Nobody was. My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head, expecting, what? Someone else sitting nearby? A speaker hidden in the trees? But there was nothing. Just the dark, the trees, and that sound. Those low, steady strums. Rachel's voice wavered. "You guys hear that?" She heard it now. The blood drained from her face. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was so complete it was deafening, like the forest itself had inhaled and held its breath. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And then Travis whispered, "We need to go." I didn't argue. None of us ran, but we moved fast, pushing our way back toward the beach, our breathing shallow, eyes darting into the dark between the trees. I kept waiting to hear it again, to hear a single note, a string plucked, some proof that what I'd heard was real. But there was nothing. By the time we made it back to the beach, the sky was dark, the last bit of sunlight fading over the water. We sat in silence, trying to process what had just happened. Nobody said much. We didn't talk about it on the drive home, didn't joke about it later, didn't try to explain it, and we never went back. Story 8. I grew up in a small town in Missouri, the kind of place where nothing really happens, but everyone still locks their doors at night. Our house was old, built in the early 60s, and sat on a quiet street lined with oak trees. It wasn't anything fancy, just a two-story home with creaky wooden floors, a drafty attic, and a basement that always smelled damp, no matter how many times my mom tried to air it out. My dad worked late shifts at the factory back then, and my mom was out of town visiting my aunt that weekend. That left me home alone on a Friday night. I was 13, too old to be scared of the dark, but still young enough that my imagination got the best of me sometimes. It was about 10 p.m., and I was downstairs watching TV, stretched out on the couch with a bowl of chips. The only light came from the flickering blue glow of the screen. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows just enough to make the house feel a little too quiet. Then I heard it, a rattling sound from upstairs. I froze, my hand halfway to my mouth with a chip. The noise wasn't loud, but it was distinct, like something shaking or knocking against wood. It lasted for maybe 3 seconds, then stopped. I muted the TV and listened, my heartbeat suddenly loud in my ears. The wind outside whistled through the trees, but the house itself was silent. Then just as I was about to convince myself I imagined it, there it was again, a rhythmic, faint rattling coming from my dad's room upstairs. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had pushed something off a shelf, or maybe the old house was settling like my dad always said. But the more I sat there, the more wrong it felt. The sound wasn't random, it was steady, controlled. I stood up, my bare feet pressing into the cold hardwood floor. The stairs leading up to the second floor were directly behind me, disappearing into darkness. I hesitated. I didn't want to go up there, but at the same time I couldn't just sit there and ignore it. My dad's room was at the end of the hall, the door usually left slightly open. If something had fallen, I'd see it. That was all I needed to do, just peek inside, confirm it was nothing, and go back to my chips and TV. I crept up the stairs, stepping carefully to avoid the spots I knew would creak. The house was dead silent now, except for the wind outside and my own breathing. As I reached the top, the hallway stretched out in front of me, dimly lit by the nightlight plugged into the bathroom socket. My dad's door was halfway open, just like always, but something was off. The air felt heavy, like the pressure in the room had changed. I took another step, my breath shallow. Then I saw it. Through the gap in the doorway, in the faint glow of the streetlight outside, I could see my dad's desk, and in front of it, his office chair. Spinning. Not fast, not wildly, but moving, turning slowly as if it had just been spinning rapidly and was now coming to a stop. I didn't move. I couldn't. There was no one in that room. The chair finally slowed, wobbling slightly before coming to a halt, facing away from the desk. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around and bolt back downstairs, but I just stood there staring at the chair, my legs locked in place. Then right as I was about to back away, the chair moved again. It turned, just a little, not fast, not sudden, just a slow, deliberate shift, as if something unseen had placed a hand on it and gently nudged it. The air in the room felt suffocating now, thick and charged like the moment before a thunderstorm. And then, a whisper, right next to my ear. Low, breathless. I didn't understand the words, but they were there, close enough that I should have felt breath on my skin, but I didn't. That was enough. I turned and ran. I don't even remember how I made it down the stairs. My feet barely touched the steps. I bolted into the living room, grabbed the phone, and called my dad. It rang, once, twice. Then his voice, his real, normal voice, answered. Yeah? I could barely get the words out. Dad, something's in your room. Silence, then, what? I was shaking. Your chair, it was spinning, and I heard something. Another pause. Then in a voice I didn't recognize, low and serious, get out of the house. I didn't ask questions. I grabbed my shoes and ran outside, standing barefoot on the cold pavement of our driveway. The night air felt impossibly crisp compared to the stifling weight of the house. I stayed there shivering until my dad pulled up 20 minutes later, his headlights cutting through the dark. He went inside first. I waited by the door, heart pounding as he flicked on the lights and moved through the house. He checked his room, the chair, the closet, nothing. When he came back downstairs, his face was unreadable. He didn't tell me I imagined it, didn't laugh it off. Instead, he sat down, ran a hand over his face, and finally said, "It happened to me once too." I didn't ask what he meant, and he never told me. We never talked about it again. But after that night, my dad stopped sleeping with his door open. Story 9. I was 3, maybe 4 years old when it happened. We lived in this old house out in the country, a place my parents swore was peaceful, but to me it never felt right. Something about it always made me uneasy, though I was too young to understand why. My parents' room was at the end of the hallway, and since I was still small, I slept in their bed most nights. I don't remember ever being afraid of the dark back then, but I woke up a lot for no reason. Just wide awake in the middle of the night, staring at the shadows in the room, listening to the quiet. It became normal. I'd wake up, roll over, look around, and eventually fall back asleep. Nothing ever happened, until one night when I woke up and saw them. They were standing in the doorway that led to the living room. Two tall figures, perfectly still. I remember thinking they looked like that old painting, American Gothic, with the farmer and his wife. But they weren't right. They were too thin. Their eyes weren't eyes at all, just hollow black spaces. I didn't scream. I don't even think I was scared at first, just confused. They didn't move, didn't do anything. They just stared at me. I don't know how long I looked at them. Eventually I got tired again and pulled the covers up to my chin, glancing one last time before shutting my eyes. They were still there. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I didn't tell my parents. I don't think I even had the words for it. How do you explain something like that when you're barely old enough to understand the world? But then it happened again. I woke up like always, blinking up at the ceiling. The fan was on, spinning slow, the way it always did at night. The room was warm, the air thick with that deep, heavy quiet that only exists in the dead of night. I turned my head toward the doorway and my stomach dropped. They were there again, the same two figures, but something felt worse this time. The air in the room was strange, charged, like the moments before a storm. The ceiling fan above me made a low humming sound, its blades cutting through the dark in a steady rhythm. I watched them, barely breathing, and then the man's mouth started to move. Not like he was talking. There was no sound, just a slow, terrible grin stretching across his face. The woman's lips curled into a smile too, wide and unnatural. That was when I knew. They knew I could see them. I went stiff, my little body frozen in place. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. The fan above me hummed louder. No, not just louder, faster. The blades, which had been turning at a steady speed just moments ago, were spinning too fast now, the whole fixture starting to sway slightly back and forth. I couldn't move. I just lay there staring at them. The grins on their faces widened, stretching into something impossible, something inhuman, and then the fan started shaking. The pull chains, those little metal beads hanging down, began clinking against the glass light cover. Soft at first, like a gentle tap, but then the sound grew frantic, rattling against the glass with a sharp, feverish intensity. The fan shouldn't have been able to go that fast. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my tiny hands clutching at the blankets. I wanted to wake my parents, to scream, but I couldn't. I couldn't take my eyes off them. Then all at once, the rattling stopped. The room fell into thick silence. I was afraid to look. I knew they were still there, but I couldn't stop myself. I peeked over the covers, just a little, and they were right there, not in the doorway anymore, standing beside the bed, towering over me, grinning. My breath caught in my throat, but before I could even react, there was a crash. The glass light cover on the fan shattered, raining down in sharp pieces onto the floor. I screamed, finally breaking out of whatever held me frozen. My father shot up beside me, wide-eyed, fumbling for the lamp on the nightstand. The moment the light clicked on, they were gone. I was sobbing, shaking so hard my whole body felt like it was coming apart. My mother sat up too, groggy and confused, trying to calm me down. My dad climbed out of bed, cursing when he stepped on the broken glass. He kept asking me what happened, but I couldn't tell him. I didn't even have the words for it. All I could do was cry. My mom held me close, rubbing my back, whispering that it was okay, that it was just a bad dream. But I knew it wasn't a dream. The glass had broken. The fan had nearly come off the ceiling, and I had seen them, standing right over me, watching, smiling. That was the worst night of my life. Story 10. I don't believe in ghosts. Let me start with that. I've heard all the stories, seen all the horror movies, and even listened to my grandma's superstitions about spirits and curses. but none of it ever really got to me. I always figured if ghosts were real, we'd have solid proof by now. You know, some real, undeniable scientific evidence. That night, though, God, that night messed me up. We were in Lahore, in a cheap hotel off one of the main roads. The kind of place where the walls are thin, the sheets feel damp, and the receptionist doesn't even bother making eye contact. It wasn't a total shithole, but it wasn't great either. Just a place to crash. It was me, Samir, Raza, and Ali. We'd been smoking hash for a couple of hours, just talking about random stuff, music, politics, the usual bullshit. It was sometime past 3 a.m. when the conversation turned to urban legends. That's how these things always start, don't they? "Bro, you ever played Bloody Mary?" Samir asked, exhaling smoke through his nose. I laughed. "You serious?" Ali rolled his eyes. "Come on, man, that's some schoolgirl shit." But Raza, already grinning, was on board. "Let's do it, right now." I don't know why, but we all just stood up. Maybe it was the hash, maybe it was boredom, but none of us backed down. The bathroom in our hotel room was small, just a dingy little thing with a cracked mirror over the sink and a flickering bulb. It looked like the perfect place to summon something. Samir and I went in first. We shut the door, turned off the light, and stared at our reflection. My heart wasn't exactly racing, but there was this weird tension in the air. Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary. Silence. Nothing happened. No movement in the mirror, no shadow, no ghostly whisper in our ears. Just the sound of our own breathing. We walked out, smirking. "Told you," I said. Riza and Ali went in next. Same thing. No ghosts, no spirits, just two idiots chanting in the dark. They came out laughing. Then Ali, still high and feeling cocky, decided to go in alone. He shut the door behind him, and we heard him muttering the words. "Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary." Silence. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Then the door opened, and he stepped out. "Bastards," he grinned. "You really thought something was gonna happen?" We all laughed. He was right. It was stupid. Then his face changed. It happened so fast I didn't even process it at first. 1 second he was grinning like an idiot, and the next his nose started bleeding. Not a little trickle, not just a few drops, full on, thick, dark blood pouring down over his lips, dripping onto his shirt. None of us said anything. Ali touched his upper lip, looked at the blood on his fingers, and froze. His entire body just locked up. The grin disappeared. His expression went blank, but his eyes looked wrong. He sat down on the bed, shaking. "Yo, Ali, you good?" Samir asked. Ali didn't answer. He just sat there, staring at nothing, his body shivering like he was naked in the snow. I nudged him. "Dude?" Nothing. His lips moved, but no sound came out. It was like he was whispering to himself, like he was answering someone we couldn't see. A cold chill ran through me. "Ali, stop messing around, man," Raza said, forcing a laugh. "It's not funny." Ali still didn't respond. His breathing got shallow, fast, like he couldn't get enough air. His hands gripped the bedsheet so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The shaking got worse. "Bro, what the fuck is wrong with him?" Samir whispered. I didn't know what to say. Ali wasn't messing around. I knew that much. He was scared, really scared. And so were we. The room felt different, heavier. The air was thick, suffocating. I felt this weird pressure in my chest, like something was pushing down on me. Then Ali's head snapped up. His eyes locked onto mine, and I swear to God, for a second, they didn't look like his eyes. They were too dark, too empty. And then, just as suddenly, he blinked, and it was him again. He gasped, sucking in air like he'd just been drowning. His whole body jerked, and he looked around, confused. "What?" We just stared at him. Ali wiped his nose, looking at the blood on his hand like he didn't understand how it got there. "What happened?" His voice was hoarse. We didn't answer. Samir got up and turned on every single light in the room. The yellow glow felt weak, useless against whatever the hell had just happened. Ali looked at us, still shaking. I think I need to go home." "Yeah," I said. "Yeah, man, let's go." None of us slept that night. I drove Ali home. And the whole way, he didn't say a word. He just stared out the window like he was afraid of seeing something in the reflection. We never talked about it again. Not really. A few months later, I asked him, just once, if he remembered that night. Ali hesitated, then shook his head. Nah, man, he said, forcing a laugh. I think we were just too high. But he was lying. I could see it in his eyes. And you know what? I never played that game again. Never will. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.